Poetry is cheering myself up, cheering myself up. Funny thing how you connected poetry with troubles. So probably because there were troubles that could not be solved in a different way. In history, that poetry is some opposite side of the history. It is something that is complementary to history. That's the individual thing of the meanings that are assigned to the history when the history gave up on itself. So it's desirable, but I don't think that it's the role or nature of poetry to reconstruct something. Poetry is rather, for my experience, the frame for my own history, for building the history. It is more generic to the prose. So this is basically if you write autobiographical prose, so you are trying to reconstruct your own history, but then the poetry is the reflection of the moments, or rather assigning something important into some events or the moments of time. So I do try to stay on the track of my personal history within the poetic moments, in which those poetic moments are some kind of milestones of my own authenticity and of the important things. As we said, unlike the history, you don't know what is the important. I don't know what is the important point, the milestone of my life, until it's some way valorized, glorified to some meaning,
yes,
assigned to poetry, given to poetry, reflected to that. So, as we started, the poetry is connected with the trouble, and it's hard to think of a bigger trouble than the war is to one. Oh yes, it did change, or it formed me as a poet. Before the war, I didn't know if it's the true instinct. I wanted to express. I love the poetry, and then wanted to reflect my life through poetry, to set up the course of my own future to poetry. In the war, I learned that need is true. That is interesting situation for that war. It was telecast war. In the telecast war, as I later learned from my friends, that they had the same feelings, those who were trying to find any meaning in their own, and in total collapse of the meaning. So few of us share the same feeling. So like having the feeling that there was two cameras in recording. One was the camera in your head, trying to understand something, to find what's going on in that over telecast, or in that avalanche of the images that were coming through the ultimately tragical situation that we were facing, and pointless situation, and violent one. So you had the thing, you always have in your mind that some story that you are telecast at some point, And you actually wanted to probe, you want to challenge the pictures in which that story of the tragedy, of the misery, in which you are emerged, and it's not like in the movies. And they said, you are trying to find the same, but you are communicate, and that poetry at that time, and that reflection was somehow to confront the images that were at the same time by the other camera up or floating up in your head above you. You are trying to conflict those pictures, because obviously that camera recording that imaginary news agency's camera that was doing that in a full-time things, those pictures did not make the sense. So did not make sense to the world or whatever, but did not make sense to us. We saw that to the visual. So the poetry in that time was direct, and that's what technique of writing, and also of verifying the truthness and the authenticity of why, of that urge of you to even communicate with the world in the poetry. Actually, there was nothing else we could do with that. And the second thing you're asking me about the poetic vision, what is poetic vision of the war? So the paradox, so we say that the poet in the war is some chronological, is somebody who makes the diary of the war, like some Anna Frank who is writing the testimony of the war. I don't think so. So there are good intentions, and that poet is some voice of consciousness of humanity that should have, it's supposed. But what we saw there, we have the class of the poets, us who already established at that time ourselves, and we were like poets, and there were the urge of the people who did not see themselves as a part of the poetry establishment, and who did react by writing and reading the poetry. At the end, some of the most relevant outcomes of that Sarajevo or Bosnian war poetry came from the people who were not nowhere. On the other hand, you had the precedents, historical precedents, about how many people, poets, took a part into that on the side of the evils. And when you take that, like Radovan Karadzic was the poet. There is the famous recording of Sarajevo that he was hosting Nabokov, in which he was directly reciting and then taking the killing and destroying the city was the fulfillment of his poetic vision. One of the questions that led to that misery and destruction and the crisis and the collapse of that Bosnian idea, there is still the country, but of what is the Bosnian. So the history, we wanted to place ourselves into some historical context. So I would say that I have a complex identity rather than multiple. So as you see, the problem with all these movements and no movements is some search to the place, time and the context in which I could carry the burden or the richness of my complex identities, and to live in relative comfort, to find a way where it's easier to deal with those. Not of this, like you are mentioning, that the countries and the places, the cities, or whatever, the places of languages through which I try on the probe my complex identity. The places function, you try really to put into some your identity to be not in fight in yourself. So the paradox, for example, with that aspect of me that is so-called Bosnian identity, it's also the very complex thing of Bosnia that was the part of, in my way, of my language identity. And at the time I grew up in Yugoslavia. So when that people started reducing or making that impossible for me to live the identity of that complex identity of Yugoslavia, so the Bosnian identity was attacked in the most vicious way. And still for me was in that part the restrictive identity that I could, because of that national, of that original identity. What was the choice? Every other choice would be some self-restriction to something, and I want the more identity, not the less identity. And also the moving to the different frameworks of the identity was, the paradox situation was that in the first time that even living in Prague and Czech Republic make many things more complicated, but for that one actually relieve me of some things. Like it was easier for me to even to deal with my Bosnian identity in Prague than to live in the Bosnian, and just to make that, to clarify. So the Bosnian identity was primarily not mentioned to my feeling of the Bosnia, of space, of culture, of language, so that at least I was not challenged to ask. So I could tell people that I'm Bosnian and to be in everything, not ask the other questions. So could be that, so that break of the Bosnian identity complicity was another in a different context. So then with that one, I faced the complex identity of some other society in transition, like the Czech society that was after half a century of total deprivation, of ideological, cultural, of itself, was regaining its historical, like, Western identity in the world that was totally already hyper real, chaotic in the way that could not express, and it was very unbalanced. So in that challenging that other imbalances put me into a situation to see through my complex identities many aspects of that one, that people going to the main story of that very intense time of the 90s in Prague could not register because they were on with their own identity switch or shift themselves. So at some point when I moved to the United States, I was a little bit sick of that, to stay even with that, or restricted by that European identity in myself. I wanted to get to the totally different context, to challenge my life and searching through poetry. Also, that's how the poetry came as a reaction, to see what remains of all of that. So that after I spent in the States like 13 years, and then became again. So the more, and the interesting thing in the States, I had no more problem with, and then European identity, it was not restriction no more for me. It was much easier for me to be even European in the United States than it was in Europe. So in many aspects, even those very trivial aspects. So where are you? Europe, they say, like in the States, are you from Paris or London? So the Prague still was getting on the map. From Sarajevo, they don't know, but even that European identity started meaning to me a little like more, and to make more sense answering to somebody from the American position about that part of identity than being asked within Europe. So there's those things that, how to say, I think that my identity was growing to the time flow, unless it, and I don't think that it leads to any kind of schizophrenia. The languages are missing. You are acquiring new languages. You live in some situation until you stop translating all the time what you experience there. And then on your basics, it was not that me who escaped his country, his language in the war. So there was a different being, like with the different languages, and I still was trying for that core, for that something. And the poetry for me was even in one language. There are so many layers, but don't worry anyone that identity never can become too complex, or there can never be, there is no such a thing like too much of identity. It is by definition and from my experience always an advantage and a great challenge. Again, as the complex identity of a Bosnian, that Bosnian literature is a very complex entity itself, and in that way, if you want to define or to see what I think about when I think about Bosnian or whatever literature in the world, are some checkpoints in which, like, that create one literature. That's some history, some consensus of what belongs to that corpus. Communication and information technology, and was there at the first days of mass use of web and new media. So that I am there, and the technology has changed the way how I perceive reality, because reality moved itself into the space of technology, into some kind of that hybrid of hyperreality. The poetry itself, but it's something else. Both an opportunity and something that should transcend. The first thing, poet sitting in front of the computer is the normal. How else? So I don't have my typewriter, and still I'm digital nomad. I make my living in the computer. So of course that I don't take my the pen, the special for the goose feather to write the poetry. It's the ritual, but there is the different kind of formatting the world. I have to step aside one step into the questioning the meaning in both technology represented world, and the world is still quest or pursuit of the same meaning of the reality. The problem with social media is the one issue should transcend. With social media, problem is that the poetry is also quest for something eternal in the things. So the first thing, any moment that makes you react in poetic way and try to grasp the poetry of that is some kind of attempt to make it to last forever, to have all the meanings. Well, the very nature of the messages on Twitter, Facebook, or whatever, is there just to inform you, to put you impulse and to bring more to your awareness of the things, of current awareness. They must be alive, otherwise none of poetry, neither poetry or philosophy would exist. But there is just the different pursuit of those two things. They might interfere to each other and might have the common ground, but still the basic thing is that philosophy is still the point of philosophy is, or the premises of philosophy is, that believe that there is meaning in the things, but it's hidden from us. So the first you have to raise the great questions, and then to improve yourself, to see the truth that is evasive and then that you are missing, but with more thought, with more focus, with more whatever effort, intelligence you will read. The poetry is much more pessimistic. Poetry at the first moment gave up on the meaning itself, does not have such ambition. The poetry is trying to assign the meanings into the things, poetic meanings, not to find the answers to the things. The poetical questions are different than philosophical, but they are still essential questions. And then the thing, there is the great poetry. If either you have the traditional old philosophy, the traditional genre from the modernism that we know from the 50s, 60s, that there is the class of poets who are recording the poetry, publishing into poetry magazines, follow and evaluated to the literary critics that are rewarded and put into national. That thing, for that one, for some dominant, what it used to be, definitely it's not. It's archaic form. It's some kind of it. For that kind of poetry, for poetry as a principle of human, principle or the dimension of human consciousness, of the need to cultivate one, or to assign the meanings. Of course there is, and it's everywhere. What forms? Different forms. So everything can be, many things can be called poetic, and the poetry has the lyrics to the music, like slam poetry, hip, or like rap, or whatever, or some video poetry there. That's all irrelevant as long as it fulfills what the poetry to one specific being, what the poetry should and could.